The whole thing started on a regular morning, a day that looked completely normal from the outside. The young man at the center of this story lived a very simple life. He wasn't loud, he wasn't the type to show off, and he never tried to stand out. Most people in his neighborhood knew him as someone who kept his head down, worked hard, and minded his own business. He would leave early in the morning for work, come home quietly in the evening, and spend most of his free time helping his family or taking small walks to clear his mind. He wasn't perfect, but he tried his best to stay honest and respectful. That was all he ever wanted, to live peacefully without bothering anyone. But life has a strange way of turning everything upside down when you least expect it. That morning, he was busy arranging tools at his workplace when he heard someone calling his name. He turned, expecting to see a co-worker, but what he saw instead made his heart skip a beat. 2 police officers were walking straight toward him in front of everyone. His hands, which were holding a small wrench, suddenly felt heavy. His co-workers stopped what they were doing and watched silently. Their eyes full of questions, the officers asked him to step aside for a moment. His breath grew short, and he kept replaying the last few days in his mind, trying to figure out what he might have done wrong. But he came up with nothing. He had no arguments with anyone, no fights, no accidents. He simply went to work and came home. Still, the presence of the police made him confused and scared. One of the officers spoke calmly but firmly. He explained that a complaint had been filed against him. A shopkeeper from a nearby market claimed that a valuable item had gone missing, and according to someone's statement, the young man had been seen near that area around the time of the incident. For a moment, the young man couldn't process what he was hearing. His eyebrows pulled together, and he stared at the officer, hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding. He felt a heaviness in his chest because he knew nothing like that had happened. He had gone to the shop a few days ago, but only to buy something small and leave. That was it. He tried to explain this, but the officers didn't seem convinced. They weren't rude, but they were doing their job. They told him that he was required to come with them for questioning and possibly appear in court depending on how things unfolded. His throat felt dry, and he swallowed hard as he tried again to defend himself. But the officer said they needed to follow the procedure. The moment he stepped away with the officers, whispers started behind him. Co-workers who had known him for years exchanged confused looks. Some of them raised their eyebrows. Others made assumptions. People always jump to conclusions when they don't know the full story. And he could feel judgment forming around him like a heavy shadow. When he reached home, his family was shocked. His mother, who always believed he was too soft-hearted, couldn't understand why someone would accuse him like that. His father grew silent and tense, the kind of silence that comes from worry. His younger siblings watched him with wide, scared eyes, unsure how to react. The young man tried to stay calm, but the truth was he felt shaken to his core. He had never experienced anything like this in his life, and he did not even know how court hearings worked. The idea of being blamed for something he had not done felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from in the following days. Things got worse. News travels fast in small neighborhoods, and soon people who had never spoken to him before were whispering about him. Some believed the accusation without question. Others pretended they were neutral but avoided him. Only a few genuinely supported him, saying things like, "We know you're not that type of person." But even their sympathy made him feel guilty for dragging them into his problems. He kept replaying the moment in his head. Why would someone blame him? Who told the shopkeeper he was near the counter? He remembered being in the shop, but he had nothing to do with the missing item. He wondered if someone had mistaken him for another person, or worse, if someone had purposely pointed fingers at him. As the days passed, he tried to gather information quietly. He revisited the shop in his mind, the aisles, the customers present, the counter where he had placed a small item he bought, the way the shopkeeper had barely looked at him. It was all so normal, so ordinary. Nothing strange happened that he could remember. Yet now, he was being accused of something serious. The officer had told him that his first hearing would take place soon. Hearing that word court felt terrifying. Court wasn't a place for people like him. It was where serious things happened, where lives could change with one wrong statement. The idea of standing in front of strangers who would judge him based on incomplete information made him anxious. He barely slept, often lying awake late at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how something so unfair could happen to him. One evening, while his family ate silently, he tried to reassure them. He told them he hadn't done anything wrong, and the truth would come out. But his voice sounded unsure even to himself. His mother reached out and placed her hand on his. Her eyes were soft, but full of worry. She said she knew he was innocent, but she also knew how hard it can be to prove yourself when people have already made up their minds. Her words stayed with him for hours after dinner. He understood exactly what she meant. Once a rumor spreads, innocence becomes harder to prove. No matter how honest you are, every morning before work, he stood in front of the mirror and looked at himself, not to check his appearance, but as if trying to find an answer written on his face. Who had done this to him? Why him? What made life suddenly twist in this direction? The day he received the official notice for the court hearing, his hands trembled slightly as he held the document. The hearing date was close, leaving him very little time to prepare. His heart pounded with fear, but he knew he had no choice but to show up and defend himself. His family offered emotional support, but there wasn't much else they could do. They weren't wealthy. They couldn't hire expensive lawyers or investigators. They simply stood behind him, hoping the judge would see the truth. Despite all the stress, he kept going to work. He didn't want to hide at home or look guilty by avoiding people. But every time someone glanced at him differently, he felt the weight of the accusation pressing on his chest. He wished he could scream that he was innocent, but he knew words alone wouldn't convince anyone. One afternoon, while sitting alone on a bench outside his house, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He tried to think calmly. He replayed that visit to the shop again in his mind. That was when a small detail flashed through his memory, something he hadn't paid much attention to earlier. The detail wasn't clear yet, just a blurry picture. But it was enough to make him open his eyes with a new sense of alertness. Maybe, just maybe, there was something he could hold on to. Something that could help him prove he wasn't the one responsible. He didn't speak about this new thought to anyone yet. He wasn't sure if it meant anything, or if his mind was just desperate to find answers. But it was the first time in days that he felt a slight spark of hope. His heart was still heavy, but at least he had something to think about besides fear and helplessness. As the hearing day approached, he walked with a mixture of anxiety and determination. He didn't have money, power, or influence. All he had was his honesty and the hope that the truth would eventually come out. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that staying silent would only let the false accusations swallow him whole. This was the beginning of a battle he never asked for, but one he had no choice but to fight. The days leading up to the court hearing were some of the hardest he had ever lived through. Every morning felt heavy, as if he was waking up with a stone tied to his chest. He tried to act normal in front of his family, but inside he was struggling to hold himself together. Even simple tasks like eating breakfast felt difficult because his mind was constantly spinning with worry. His family did their best to encourage him, but they too were under stress. His father started coming home later from work, trying to earn a little more in case the situation required money. His mother, who usually laughed easily, had become quiet and thoughtful. She often sat near the window with her hands folded, lost in thought. His siblings didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the tension in the house. The young man didn't want to burden anyone with his fears, so he kept most of his emotions to himself. But the pressure of being accused for something he didn't do was slowly eating away at him. His mind kept replaying the moment when the officers approached him at work. Sometimes he wondered if this was actually happening, or if he would suddenly wake up and realize it was just a bad dream. But every time he looked at the court notice lying on the table, he was reminded that this was real. The shopkeeper who blamed him was not a stranger. The market was small, and the young man had been there many times before. The shopkeeper was known to be strict, but not unreasonable. That was why the accusation confused him even more. Why would the shopkeeper rush to blame him? Surely the man must have known that accusing someone falsely was a serious matter. But the more the young man thought about it, the more confusing everything became. One afternoon, he decided to visit the market again, not to confront anyone, but to observe quietly. He walked through the crowd, keeping his head down so people wouldn't recognize him easily. Some people whispered as he passed by, and though he couldn't hear their words clearly, he knew they were talking about him. Every whisper pierced his confidence a little more. He stood near the shop where it all began. The shopkeeper was busy attending customers. For a moment, the young man wondered if he should approach him and ask why he had been accused. But he didn't have the courage. He felt like no matter what he said, the shopkeeper wouldn't believe him. He wasn't sure if the shopkeeper genuinely thought he was guilty or if someone had pressured him into saying it. Instead of going inside, he stepped back and watched the shop from a distance. He tried to remember every detail from the day he visited. The shop had been somewhat crowded. A couple of people were standing near the counter. One person in particular had seemed impatient, moving around a bit too quickly. He couldn't remember their face clearly, but the memory of their restless behavior stuck with him. Was that person involved? Could they have taken the item and slipped away before anyone noticed? Could they have used his presence in the shop as a cover, knowing he had no reason to be suspected? The thought made sense, at least more sense than him stealing anything. He returned home that evening feeling slightly more hopeful, but still unsure. He needed something stronger than a vague memory if he wanted to defend himself. The court wouldn't accept half-formed ideas or emotional explanations. He needed facts. A friend from his neighborhood, someone who believed in him, visited him that night. This friend had heard about the accusation and wanted to help. They sat outside under the dim streetlight, talking quietly so the neighbors wouldn't hear. His friend listened to everything, the visit to the shop, the items on the shelf, the movement of customers, the missing CCTV camera, and the strange behavior of that one person. After hearing every detail, his friend asked him a simple question. "Have you checked if the shop had multiple cameras?" The young man paused. He hadn't thought about that. He assumed the missing camera footage meant no cameras were functioning. But maybe there were other angles the shopkeeper hadn't mentioned. Maybe someone intentionally avoided showing that footage. The thought sent a sudden wave of urgency through him. If there were other cameras, they might have captured something important. But as soon as he felt hopeful, he also felt helpless. He had no legal authority to demand footage, no money to hire a lawyer, and no guarantee the shopkeeper would cooperate. The shopkeeper already seemed convinced he was guilty. Why would he help prove otherwise? Still, even a small possibility was better than none. His friend encouraged him not to give up. Sometimes the truth hides in places you don't expect, and all it takes is the right moment for it to come out. That night, he lay awake thinking about the upcoming hearing. What would happen if he couldn't prove his innocence? He imagined the judge looking at him sternly, the shopkeeper pointing fingers, the crowd watching silently, waiting for a verdict. His stomach twisted with fear. The thought of being punished for something he never did made him feel almost breathless. He thought about how easily an innocent person could be pulled into trouble just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wondered how many others had faced similar situations. Ordinary, quiet people who got caught in storms they didn't create. On the other side of the neighborhood, the shopkeeper was also dealing with pressure. The missing item had caused him financial loss, and he was determined to find someone to blame. He believed the young man had behaved suspiciously on the day of the incident. But deep inside, even he felt unsure because he hadn't actually seen the theft happen. Still, admitting he might have made a mistake was not something he was ready for. The young man didn't know any of this, but he felt the weight of the shopkeeper's determination. The closer the court date got, the more tense he became. He tried to distract himself with work, but distractions didn't help much. His mind always drifted back to the same questions. Why him? Who did this? And what if the truth never came out? One day before the hearing, he decided to take a long walk to clear his thoughts. He walked past old streets, familiar walls, and childhood memories. For a moment, he wished he could go back to a time when life was simple and problems were small. But he wasn't a child anymore, and life didn't work that way. During the walk, he noticed something he had forgotten. A small shop across from the accused shop had a camera outside. It was pointed toward the street, but might have captured something. His heart began to race. The camera belonged to a small tea stall owner, a calm, elderly man who had always been kind to him. Without wasting a moment, he went to the stall. The elderly man looked surprised to see him, but welcomed him warmly. The young man hesitated before speaking, unsure if he should ask. But this was his only chance. He explained the situation carefully, trying not to sound desperate. The elderly man listened quietly. When he finished, the man nodded slowly and said he would check the recordings. But he warned that the footage might have been overwritten since many days had passed. The young man waited anxiously as the man went through the old files. Minutes felt like hours. His palms were sweating, and he kept staring at the small screen, praying for anything, any small clue. But in the end, they found nothing useful. The camera angle showed only the street, not the inside of the shop or the customers. It didn't capture the crucial moment. The young man felt crushed, but he forced a sad smile and thanked the elderly man before leaving, even though the footage wasn't helpful. He appreciated the man's kindness. It meant something to him to know that not everyone doubted him. By the time he returned home, the sun was setting. The hearing was now only hours away. He knew he didn't have strong evidence. All he had were his memories, his honesty, and the small clues he hoped to piece together in front of the judge. But despite everything, something inside him refused to break. He felt scared, but also determined. Maybe it was the way his family looked at him, trusting him completely. Maybe it was the support of the few people who believed in him. Or maybe it was simply the desire to clear his name and go back to the peaceful life he once knew. Whatever the reason, he made a silent promise to himself that night. When he stood in the courtroom, he would speak the truth clearly. He would not let fear silence him. He would not let the false accusation define him. The battle ahead was heavy, but he was ready to face it. The day of the hearing arrived sooner than he expected. The morning felt different from any other morning he had lived. It was quiet, heavier, almost as if the air itself knew something important was about to happen. The young man woke up before sunrise. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, running his fingers through his hair, trying to calm the nervous storm inside him. It didn't help much. His hands shook slightly every time. He looked at the clock. His mother knocked softly on his door and brought him a warm cup of tea. She didn't say much, but the worry in her eyes said enough. His father stood behind her, silent as always, but the young man could feel the unspoken support in his father's glance. Even his siblings stayed quiet that morning, watching him with innocence and concern. After drinking a few sips of tea, he got ready. His clothes were simple but clean. He looked at himself in the mirror once again, not to check his appearance, but to give himself courage. He whispered a small prayer in his heart. He didn't ask for victory. All he asked for was fairness. His family walked with him to the court, but only he stepped inside. The building looked old and serious, with walls that had heard countless stories, some of justice, some of heartbreak. As he walked through the hallway, he noticed other people waiting for their cases. Some looked angry, some hopeless, some frustrated. He felt like he was joining a world he never wanted to be part of. The courtroom was crowded when he entered. He didn't expect so many people to be there. Neighbors, market vendors, shopkeepers, and even people he rarely spoke to were sitting in the wooden benches. Some were curious, some judgmental, some just waiting to see what would unfold. The air felt thick with whispers and quiet discussions. The shopkeeper who accused him was already there, sitting confidently with his arms crossed. His expression was stern, almost certain that he would get justice. When his eyes met the young man's, the shopkeeper looked away as if he didn't want to acknowledge him. The young man found a seat in a corner, trying to stay calm. His hands were cold, and his heart thumped loudly, almost loud enough to echo in the room. A court assistant asked him to wait until his name was called. During those moments of waiting, every minute felt like an hour. He replayed the entire situation again and again. He remembered every detail of the shop visit, every word spoken by the officers, every expression on his family's faces. He wondered if he should have tried harder to gather evidence. He wondered if anyone would believe him without solid proof. The fear of being misunderstood was now heavier than the fear of any punishment. Finally, his name was called. He stood up slowly, feeling all the eyes in the room shift toward him. His legs felt stiff, but he forced himself to walk toward the front. His steps echoed slightly on the floor. When he reached the front, he stood straight, though his shoulders trembled just a little. The judge entered the room. Everyone rose. The judge sat down and began reviewing the case papers. The atmosphere suddenly became very still, very serious. The young man could feel the intensity in the room. The shopkeeper was asked to speak first. He stepped forward confidently and began explaining what happened from his point of view. He described the missing item, the value of it, and how he believed the young man had been near the counter around the time of the incident. He spoke with certainty, his voice steady, almost convincing. The young man listened quietly, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He knew the shopkeeper believed he was telling the truth, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. When the shopkeeper finished, the judge asked a few questions. One question made the shopkeeper hesitate slightly: the missing CCTV footage. The judge wanted to know why the footage was unavailable. The shopkeeper struggled to give a clear answer, mentioning technical problems and unclear recording. His voice, which had been confident before, wavered just a little during this part. The young man noticed it, and so did some people in the courtroom. After the shopkeeper stepped back, it was the young man's turn. His heart raced so fast he thought he might faint, but he took a deep breath and walked to the front. His palms were sweaty, his voice uncertain at first. But once he started speaking, something shifted inside him. He explained the entire situation calmly. He told the judge that he had visited the shop that day, but only to buy something small. He shared the exact time he was there, what he bought, and how long he stayed. He did not exaggerate or change anything to sound stronger. He kept his words simple and honest. Then he shared the small details he had, remembered the anxious customer who moved around too quickly, the sudden disappearance of the camera footage, the rushed accusation without proper checking. He didn't blame anyone or try to sound clever. He simply told the truth with sincerity. As he spoke, the courtroom grew quieter. People who had whispered before were now listening closely. Even the shopkeeper looked uneasy, shifting slightly in his seat. The young man felt the weight of every word leaving his mouth, but he also felt lighter with every truth he revealed. When he finished, the judge looked at him carefully. The judge then began questioning him gently, trying to understand his side more clearly. The young man answered every question honestly, without hesitation. His voice grew steadier with every answer. At one point, the judge asked him why he hadn't brought strong evidence to support his claims. The young man lowered his eyes and said softly that he didn't have the resources or knowledge to collect evidence. He said he only had his honesty and the belief that the truth would eventually come out. Hearing those words, a quiet wave passed through the room. Some people looked down, realizing they had been too quick to judge him. Others began murmuring, questioning whether the shopkeeper had rushed to blame the wrong person. The judge then asked the shopkeeper again about the missing footage and the identity of other customers present that day. The shopkeeper appeared uncomfortable. His earlier confidence had started to crumble. He admitted that he hadn't clearly seen the theft happen. He only assumed it was the young man because he had been there shortly before the item went missing. The judge didn't look pleased with such assumptions. The judge reminded the shopkeeper that accusations must be based on facts, not guesses. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. For the first time, the young man felt a small spark of hope. He didn't show it on his face, but inside, he felt a shift like the sun peeking through heavy clouds. Then the judge asked the young man if he had anything else to say. He looked up slowly, took a deep breath, and gathered his courage. He knew his words needed to come from his heart, not from fear. He paused for a moment, the entire courtroom waiting. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with a calm strength that surprised even him. He said he had lived his whole life trying to stay honest, not because he wanted praise, but because he believed honesty was the only thing that truly belonged to a person. He said he wouldn't have the courage to stand there if he were guilty. But the real pain wasn't being accused, was being judged without being heard. Those words didn't sound dramatic. They sounded real, sincere, and raw. And that was why they hit everyone deeply. When he finished speaking, the room fell silent. No whispering, no shifting, no murmuring. Even the judge paused his writing and looked at him for a long moment. That silence was heavier than any noise. It felt like the truth had reached people in a way evidence sometimes couldn't. The judge then announced that the case required further investigation. The hearing was not over, but the judgment was no longer one-sided. The young man had finally been heard. As he walked back to his seat, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. He wasn't cleared yet, but for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like he had a real chance. The truth had started to break through the shadows. When the morning light slipped through the window, the house felt strangely quiet. It was the kind of silence that made a person think something important was about to happen. The boy woke up early, even before the birds outside began singing. He lay still for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, feeling both nervous and hopeful. Today mattered, not just for him, but for his father too. It was the day he had been waiting for ever since everything in their lives had turned upside down. He sat up slowly and rubbed his eyes. His grandmother was already awake, preparing breakfast in the small kitchen. She moved gently, almost as if she didn't want to disturb anyone, though everyone knew she barely slept these days. When she saw him walking in, she gave him a tired smile. "You didn't sleep much either, did you?" she said softly. He shook his head. "I kept thinking about what might happen today." She placed a warm cup of tea in front of him. "Whatever happens, just remember you've already done more than anyone expected. Your father knows that too." He nodded, but his stomach was still tight with worry. Even though he was young, he understood how serious everything had become. Too many people misunderstood his father. Too many people spoke without knowing the truth. And now everyone was waiting to see what the boy would say in court. He had always been quiet. The kind of kid who didn't like big crowds or loud places. But life doesn't always ask if you're ready. It simply puts you where you're needed. As he took small sips of tea, he remembered what happened the day before, how the lawyer had gently told him that a child's voice could sometimes break walls even adults couldn't. He wasn't sure if that was true, but he hoped it was. He wanted nothing more than to help the man he loved the most. After breakfast, he went to help his father get ready. The man was sitting on the bed, holding an old watch in his hand, the one his father had given him years ago. He wasn't wearing it, just staring at it like it held some kind of strength. When he looked up at his son, his eyes were filled with both pride and sadness. "You don't have to do anything that scares you," he said. "But I want to," the boy replied. "They need to hear what really happened." The father placed the watch gently on the table. "Then speak from your heart. That's all you need." They left the house a few hours later. The road to the courthouse felt longer than usual. Cars, people, noise, everything seemed sharper, heavier. The boy held his grandmother's hand tightly, and she kept brushing her thumb over his fingers, like she was trying to pass her courage into him. When they reached the courthouse entrance, several people were already gathered there. Some were curious, some were whispering, some were staring too long. The boy kept his eyes low. He didn't want to know what people were thinking. He only wanted to focus on what he had to say. Inside, the air was cold and smelled like paper and old wood. He could hear shoes tapping against the floor, voices echoing, doors opening and closing. He had been there before, but today everything felt different, much heavier, much more real. The lawyer met them in the hallway. She knelt slightly to match the boy's height. "Remember," she said warmly, "you're not here to fight with anyone. You're just here to tell the truth in your own words. Everyone will listen, and I'll be right there if you need me." He nodded, even though his throat felt dry. When the hearing finally started, the boy sat quietly next to his grandmother, watching people move around the room. The judge walked in, and the courtroom fell silent instantly. The judge's expression was serious, focused, the kind that made people sit up straighter. The boy's father was asked to stand. Questions were asked. Papers were read. People spoke politely, but the tension in the room was heavy enough to feel. The boy watched his father's hands trembling slightly. It wasn't fear, it was the worry of a parent who didn't want his child to suffer because of him. Then the moment came. The lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, the boy would like to say something." A ripple went through the room. A child speaking wasn't common. Some people raised their eyebrows. Some leaned forward. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at the boy. "Are you sure you want to speak?" The judge asked gently. The boy stood up slowly. "Yes," he whispered, but the microphone carried his voice clearly. His feet felt heavy as he walked toward the front. His heart beat so loudly he wondered if everyone could hear it. The courtroom seemed bigger now, with too many eyes watching him. But he remembered his father's words, "Speak from the heart," so he took a deep breath. "My father didn't do anything wrong," he began, his voice trembling at first. "People think they know what happened, but they don't. I was there. I saw everything." His hands were shaking, but he continued. He didn't shout. He didn't hurt anyone. He tried to stop things from getting worse. But people blamed him because they didn't understand. A few people shifted in their seats. The room was completely quiet. He always teaches me to be honest and respectful. He helps our neighbors. He takes care of my grandmother. He never lies. If something bad happened, it wasn't because of him." The judge watched him closely, listening without interrupting. The boy swallowed hard and continued. "I know I'm young, but I know when someone is kind. My father is kind. He didn't deserve what happened after that day, and I don't want him to be punished for something he didn't do." He took another breath, this time steadier. "Please listen to him. Please believe him. That's all I want." When he finished, the judge didn't speak right away. Neither did anyone else. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was thoughtful, almost heavy with meaning. The boy walked back to his seat. His grandmother squeezed his shoulder gently. His father's eyes were wet, but he quickly wiped them, not wanting his son to see. The hearing continued, but something had changed. The tone in the room softened. Even the way people looked at his father shifted. Words that were once sharp became calmer. Questions that were once cold became more careful. It was as if the boy's honesty had cleared a fog no one realized was clouding the truth. When everything finally ended for the day, the judge said he needed time to review the statements. But his voice carried a hint of understanding it didn't have before. As they left the courthouse, the boy felt lighter. The air outside seemed warmer now, and he could finally breathe deeply again. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were brave," he said quietly. "Braver than I ever could be." The boy looked up at him. "I just told the truth." "Sometimes," his father replied, "that's the bravest thing anyone can do." They walked home together, feeling a small spark of hope growing inside them. The road was the same, the sky was the same, but something in their hearts had shifted. Maybe the world wasn't fully fair yet. Maybe things were still uncertain. But today, the boy had taken a step that would stay with him forever, and deep down, He knew one thing clearly: whatever the final decision would be, he wasn't afraid anymore, because he had finally spoken his truth, and the world had listened.